Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Disappearance of Dorothy Arnold. In the gentle hush of evening, we invite you to journey back in time over a century ago to the wintry streets of New York City in 1910. In this calm and unhurried narrative, we will explore one of the era's most enduring mysteries, the disappearance of Miss Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold. Dorothy was a 25-year-old socialite, an heiress born into privilege, who stepped out of her family's Manhattan home one December day and vanished without a trace. Her story has all the elements of a quiet enigma: an affluent family, a young woman with secret aspirations, and the bustling backdrop of early 20th century New York. As we stroll through this tale, we will preserve every known fact, every theory, and every detail of Dorothy's life and the investigation that followed. We will walk at a slow, dreamlike pace, painting the scene of her world and gently pondering what might have happened. Make yourselves comfortable as we begin this soft documentary-style exploration. You might imagine yourself in a dimly lit study or a cozy armchair, listening as the history of Dorothy Arnold's disappearance unfolds like a story told by a kindly narrator. We'll start by setting the stage, describing who Dorothy was, the era she lived in, and the life she led up until that fateful day. Then, we'll guide you through the timeline of her last known hours and the extensive, perplexing search that ensued. Along the way, we'll pause to picture the scenes in rich detail, the grand avenues, in the quiet parks of old New York, the elegant bookstores and tea rooms she frequented, and the reverent silence of her family's home as they waited for her return. Each possibility of her fate will be considered in turn, gently and thoroughly. By the end, though the mystery remains unsolved, we hope to leave you with a sense of resolution and tranquility, as if you have wandered with us through the echoes of the past. So let us begin our late-night journey into the past. Take a deep breath, relax, and imagine the gaslights and the horse-drawn carriages of Manhattan in 1910. Envision the calm falling snow, or the crisp winter air on Fifth Avenue. In this soothing narrative, nothing will jump out to startle you. We will tread carefully through the facts and theories, like footsteps crunching softly on fresh snow. Now, we turn our attention to the life of Dorothy Arnold, who she was, and the world she inhabited, before we follow her on that December day when she never came home. Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold was born into a life of comfort and social prominence. Her father, Francis Rose Arnold, was a wealthy importer, known for dealings in perfumes and essence. The Arnold family lived in a lavish home at 108 East 79th Street in Manhattan, a posh address on the Upper East Side of New York City. Dorothy grew up with all the advantages that wealth could provide. She attended the finest schools. After finishing at the exclusive Felton School for Girls, she continued her education at Bryn Mawr College, a prestigious women's college near Philadelphia. She was intelligent and cultured, fluent in several languages, and moved in the highest social circles. By all accounts, Dorothy was a glamorous young woman who spent her days at teas, luncheons, and elite social gatherings typical of New York's high society. Yet under the polished surface of debutante life, Dorothy longed for something more personal and creative. She aspired to become a writer, harboring literary ambitions that were uncommon for women of her station at the time. In the early 1900s, it was generally expected that a woman like Dorothy would marry into another prominent family and settle into society life. But Dorothy had other ideas. She wrote short stories and submitted them to magazines, hoping to make her own mark. Unfortunately, her initial forays into writing met with rejection. One of her short stories, poignantly titled Poinsettia Flames, was sent to the esteemed McClure's magazine only to be rejected and returned shortly before her disappearance. At home, Dorothy's family did not take her literary dreams very seriously. In fact, her relatives teased and laughed at her writing efforts, which left Dorothy feeling humiliated and discouraged. After one rejection, she found life a torment among her amused relatives, as a news account later described. Determined to pursue her passion despite the ridicule, Dorothy began to take steps to keep her writing activities private. She even rented a post office box so she could receive correspondence from publishers away from prying eyes at home. By using a private mailbox, she hoped to hide any returned manuscripts or rejection letters from her family and their servants, thereby sparing herself further embarrassment. It's touching to imagine her carefully checking the secret mailbox, heart fluttering with hope that maybe this time a story would be accepted, or at least a rejection would remain her own private disappointment. Dorothy's desire for independence didn't stop at her writing. By 1910, this well-educated young woman was yearning for a life of her own, beyond the walls of her family mansion. She had even asked her parents for permission to move out and live in her own apartment downtown. Specifically, Dorothy dreamed of getting a studio apartment in Greenwich Village, the bohemian quarter of the city known for its artist communities and literary gatherings. One can almost picture Dorothy, imagining a modest but charming apartment with big windows overlooking the bustling streets, a place where she could write her stories in peace, perhaps decorate with her own chosen furnishings and books, and live by her own schedule. But such a move was far too modern and unorthodox for her conservative father. Francis Arnold flatly refused his daughter's request to live on her own, insisting that a respectable young lady of their standing should remain under her parents' roof until marriage. In that era, especially in families of their class, it was considered improper for an unmarried woman to live independently. So, despite her ambitions in modern spirit, Dorothy stayed in her parents' mansion, her dreams of autonomy deferred. Still, Dorothy found small ways to assert her independence. She continued writing in private, shielding her creative efforts from scorn. She maintained a lively social life, but also cultivated a sense of privacy about her personal aspirations and relationships. By late 1910, Dorothy had an active circle of friends and acquaintances, and unknown to her family at first, she was involved in a secret romantic relationship. Dorothy's life was not all innocent teas and cotillions. Like many young people, she had facets to her personality and activities that kept separate from her family's expectations. As we shall soon see, some of those secrets would only come to light after she disappeared, leaving her relatives stunned. Imagine Dorothy at this stage of her life. She is on the cusp of something. It's late 1910, and the holiday season is approaching. Her younger sister Marjorie is about to debut in society with a grand coming out party, and Dorothy is dutifully planning to support that event. But Dorothy herself is 25, an age which many of her peers would already be married, and she is still living at home, feeling the weight of both her family's expectations and her own unfulfilled yearnings. Perhaps at night, in the quiet of her room, she writes in her journal or drafts another short story, pouring her feelings onto paper. Does she feel trapped in a gilded cage, longing to prove herself as more than just an heiress? What might Dorothy have been thinking in those days, in weeks before her disappearance? It's easy to imagine her gazing out of her bedroom window at the lights of the city beyond, wondering when her life would truly begin. To truly picture Dorothy's story, it helps to envision the setting of New York City in the year 1910. This was the tail end of the Gilded Age and the dawn of a modern era. It was a world of elegant horse-drawn carriages sharing the streets with newfangled motor cars, of gaslight and early electric light mingling to illuminate the city after dusk. Skyscrapers were just beginning to punctuate the Manhattan skyline, and the city hummed with energy. Yet, there was no internet, no television, not even radio yet to spread news instantly. Telephones and newspaper were king. People dressed formally to go downtown. Men in suits and overcoats, women in long dresses, cinched waists, and broad hats adorned with ribbons and feathers. Dorothy's family lived uptown, but the day-to-day basis, much of the social and shopping life of a young lady like her, revolved around Fifth Avenue, which was and remains one of New York's grandest boulevard. In 1910, Fifth Avenue was sometimes called Millionaire's Row, in its upper stretches lined with mansions of prominent families. Further down in the 20s and 30s streets, it boasted luxury shops, bookstores, tea rooms, and fashionable department stores. This was where well-heeled New Yorkers went to stroll and shop, especially in the afternoons. Envision a clear, cold day in December. The avenue is busy with pedestrians despite a chill in the air. The storefronts are decorated for the upcoming Christmas season. Perhaps garlands and wreaths adorn the doors. Street vendors on corners might be selling roasted chestnuts, their warm, nutty aromas wafting through the brisk air. There is a clip-clop of horses pulling elegant carriages along the street, mixing with the occasional honk of an early automobile. Ladies walk by in long coats and gloves, their breaths visible in the cold air, and gentlemen tip their hats in greeting. This was the bustling, refined world that Dorothy stepped into when she left her house on the day she disappeared. Central Park, that great expanse of greenery, and in winter, a realm of bare trees and frozen ponds, lies just west of Fifth Avenue. The park offered a quieter, more secluded path for someone walking home to the Upper East Side from Midtown. In winter, Central Park can be quite serene. The lawns and trees perhaps dusted with snow, the footpath crunching under boots. The Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir, simply the Central Park Reservoir back then, occupies a large space in the park. And in December, its waters might be partly frozen, shining dull and glassy under a pale afternoon sun. Gas lamps, or early electric lamps, line some pathways, ready to glow as daylight wanes early in the winter. It's easy to imagine that as twilight approached, the park could become rather shadowy and quiet, especially in the less frequented areas, a place that could seem a little eerie or peaceful, depending on one's frame of mind. This is the stage on which Dorothy's final known hours played out. The elegant Fifth Avenue, with its shops and people, and the quieter potential route home through Central Park's wintry avenues. With this setting in mind, let us walk with Dorothy on the day she went missing, observing each step in detail as known from the historical records, and adding gentle impressions of what she might have seen, heard, or felt. Monday, December 12th, 1910. Dawned cold and clear in New York City. For the Arnold family, it started as an ordinary day. Dorothy had told her mother, Mary, that she planned to go out that afternoon to do some shopping. Specifically, she wanted to find a new evening gown to wear to an upcoming debutante party for her sister Marjorie. This was perfectly normal errand for a young woman of her social status. Shopping for a dress was something she did often, usually accompanied by her mother or friends. On this day, however, Dorothy chose to go alone. Around midday, some accounts say about 11 a.m., others say it's closer to 1:30 p.m., Dorothy left the family home on East 79th Street and set out towards Fifth Avenue. Before she left, her mother offered to accompany her on the shopping trip, as mothers and daughters often did. But Dorothy declined the offer. If I find anything I like, I'll telephone you, she assured her mother in a casual tone. With that, Dorothy stepped out into the crisp December day, wearing a long blue coat over a matching blue tailor-made dress and a fashionable velvet hat. She had a generous budget of about $25 in cash with her, a substantial sum in those days, equivalent to over $600 in today's money. In addition, she could charge purchases to her father's account at various shops. Picture Dorothy leaving her front door. Perhaps she buttons her coat against the chill and feels a little rush of independence as she walks off unaccompanied. The city streets in her Upper East Side neighborhood are tidy and lined with brownstones and mansions. The sky is pale, and her breath puffs white as she walks. It's just a short stroll west to Fifth Avenue. Possibly a family chauffeur could have driven her, but it seems she went on foot. She was young and strong, and walking was a common way to get around Manhattan back then, especially for a short distance. Dorothy's first known stop that day was at a candy shop where she purchased a box of chocolates. We can imagine her stepping inside a small, cozy confectionery, perhaps Park and Tilford's, or another fine candy shop of the era. The warmth inside would have been welcome, and the air sweet with the scent of chocolate and sugar. She might have selected some of her favorite chocolates, maybe as a little treat to enjoy during her shopping, or perhaps as a gift. She paid for the candy and then continued on her way, blending into the flow of well-dressed shoppers along Fifth Avenue. Her next destination was one of her favorite places, Brentano's bookstore on Fifth Avenue. Brentano's was a well-known bookstore, a cultural haven for book lovers. When Dorothy pushed open its heavy door, she would have entered a refined world of shelves lined with novels, poetry, and fine stationery. The store was likely heated by a coal stove, making it a snug refuge from the outdoor chill. Perhaps soft electric lights or gas lamps illuminated the display of the latest books. Dorothy was fond of literature, and it was not uncommon for her to spend time browsing in Brentano's for the newest titles. On this day, she spent some minutes looking through the books on the new fiction counter. With the holiday season near, there might have been a festive bustle in the store. Other shoppers looking for Christmas gifts, clerks busy wrapping purchases in paper and twine. After some browsing, Dorothy selected a book to buy. It was titled An Engaged Girl's Sketches by Emily Calvin Blake. This book was a collection of light-hearted romantic stories that had been published in a ladies' magazine. It's an interesting choice. Perhaps Dorothy picked it as a bit of amusing, escapist reading, or maybe even as a humorous reference since she herself was not yet engaged. She took the book to the counter and charged the purchase to her family's account. A normal practice for society families. The clerk would have known the Arnold name, and Dorothy left the store with a neatly wrapped book tucked under her arm. Outside, as Dorothy emerged onto the sidewalk, fate brought a chance encounter. She bumped into an acquaintance, a young woman named Gladys King, who was a friend of Dorothy's and of her sister Marjorie. Gladys King was around Dorothy's age and moved in the same social circles. In fact, Gladys had just received an invitation to Marjorie's debut party, which was to be a grand event. Gladys was on her way to meet her own mother for lunch when she spotted Dorothy. The two young women stopped to chat briefly in front of Brentano's. They probably exchanged pleasantries about the upcoming debut and the holiday plans. Gladys later recalled that Dorothy seemed in good spirits, cheerful, and normal. Dorothy even laughed when Gladys handed her the RSVP note for Marjorie's party in person as a joke about saving postage. There was no sign of distress in Dorothy's demeanor. If anything, she appeared as lovely and steady in good humor as ever. After a few minutes, Gladys had to rush off. She realized she was late to meet her mother for their lunch date, and so she excused herself. As Gladys departed, Dorothy told her that she planned to walk home through Central Park that afternoon. It was about 2 p.m. at this point, and although it was winter, the idea of a brisk walk through the park in the daylight might have appealed to Dorothy. Perhaps, she thought, the fresh air and scenery would be enjoyable. Or maybe she wanted time alone to mull over thoughts. It wasn't a terribly long walk from 27th Street, where the bookstore was located, up to the Arnold's home on 79th Street, maybe a couple of miles. Cutting diagonally through Central Park could shorten the journey and provide a pleasant break from the busy streets. Gladys King later noted that as she reached for the far corner of the block, she turned and waved at Dorothy one last time. Dorothy waved back. This little gesture is poignant in hindsight. It was the last confirmed sighting of Dorothy Arnold by someone who knew her. In that moment, Dorothy was standing on the bustling Fifth Avenue sidewalk, a package under her arm, smiling and waving to her friend. in the bright early afternoon. To Gladys and everyone else around, nothing seemed amiss. Dorothy looked like an ordinary young woman about to continue her day's errand, or perhaps head home. What happened next remains the core of the mystery. Dorothy Arnold, after bidding goodbye to Gladys, presumably started making her way north. Did she indeed walk into Central Park as she had mentioned? If so, she would have entered the park perhaps around 59th Street, the southern edge of the park, or a bit further up, and then traversed the winding path amid the leafless trees in winter stillness. We can imagine her footsteps on the gravel path, maybe passing the statue of Alice in Wonderland, or pausing by the frozen lake. Was Dorothy joined by anyone during that walk, or followed? Did she stop to rest on a bench for a moment, lost in the thought as the city's noises grew distant? Or alternatively, did she change her mind and hail a cab or streetcar, or walk up the avenue instead of the park? The truth is, after 2 p.m., no one who recognized Dorothy ever saw her again. She vanished into the city, leaving behind no clues of where she went or what happened. It's a haunting image. A young woman walking off into an afternoon, seemingly safe and familiar with her surroundings, and then disappearing as completely as if she had stepped into a pocket of air. What might Dorothy have been thinking and feeling as she walked away from Brentano's? Was she pleased with her new book, eager to read it at home by the fire? Was she mulling over the conversation with Gladys, or perhaps brooding about something entirely different? Her writing, her relationship, or an unresolved worry? Did Dorothy sense anything odd? A person trailing her? Or a sudden idea that made her divert from her path? We are left only with questions. The day that had started so normally for Dorothy took a turn into the unknown in those afternoon hours. As evening descended on New York, and the street lamps flickered to life, the Arnold family began to realize that Dorothy had not returned home. When night fell on December 12, 1910, Dorothy's place at the family dinner table was conspicuously empty. The Arnolds were immediately concerned, but at first they tried to stay calm. It wasn't absolutely unheard of for Dorothy to be slightly late if she had met a friend or decided to stay out, but she had never skipped a family meal without warning them in advance. As the clock ticked past the usual dinner hour, and Dorothy still hadn't come home or called, her family's worry grew. They ate without her, the conversation surely subdued, each member casting glances at the door or the telephone, hoping for some word. By later that evening, Dorothy's mother Mary, Father Francis, her brother John, and sister Marjorie were all extremely anxious. However, the Arnolds were also very protective of their privacy and social reputation. The idea of telephoning the police right away and announcing that Dorothy was missing felt drastic, and to Francis Arnold, unthinkable at that particular moment. He feared drawing unwanted publicity and scandal. In high society circles of that era, maintaining one's dignity and avoiding gossip was of paramount importance. The family's first instinct was to handle the matter discreetly themselves. They began by making quiet inquiries. That night, they phoned a few of Dorothy's close friends, perhaps people she might have visited, or who might have seen her during the day. Each call was done in a hushed, careful manner. They asked if Dorothy had possibly dropped by or mentioned any plans. When each friend said no, the family urged them to please not mention the phone call to anyone. This shows how desperately the Arnolds wanted to avoid news of Dorothy's disappearance getting out. They were hoping, perhaps, that she would turn up safe by morning, and all of this would be swept under the rug as a misunderstanding or minor mishap. As the night wore on, one of the friends the family had contacted, Elsie Henry, grew worried enough to call back to the Arnold residence around midnight. Elsie asked if Dorothy had come home. Mary Arnold answered the phone. In that tense moment, she chose to pretend that everything was fine. With forced brightness, Mrs. Arnold lied. "Yes, she's here," she said, claiming Dorothy had returned and gone straight to bed with a headache. There was a pause on the line when Elsie then asked to speak with Dorothy, and Mary had to improvise. She explained that Dorothy couldn't come to the phone because she was not feeling well enough to talk. One can imagine Mary Arnold holding the phone, perhaps her hands trembling slightly as she uttered this false reassurance. After hanging up, the family must have exchanged troubled looks. They had hoped to alleviate Elsie's concern, but they themselves were left in a growing state of panic. Dorothy was still missing, and now they were keeping up a facade. That night must have been a sleepless one in the Arnold mansion. Perhaps Francis Arnold paced the drawing room in his slippers, glancing frequently at the door as if expecting it to open. Maybe Dorothy's mother sat by the window, watching the dark streets outside for any sign of her daughter's silhouette. In the silence, a mantel clock ticking on the wall would have sounded unnaturally loud, each minute stretching on. What scenario might have ran through their heads? Did they think Dorothy might have been in an accident, or delayed by some innocent circumstance? Or did darker fears creep in? We know in hindsight that the family did not yet suspect the full scope of what might have happened, but any unexplained absence would be cause for dread. It's likely they barely slept as the city slumbered. On the morning of December 13th, 1910, with Dorothy still not home, the Arnolds realized they needed help, but they still were not ready to call the police. Over breakfast, which must have been a somber affair, they made a plan. Dorothy's older brother, John Arnold, contacted a friend of his named John S. Keith. Keith was a young lawyer, a Harvard graduate, and a trusted family friend who had at times escorted Dorothy to social events. If anyone outside the family could be counted on for delicate assistance, it was John Keith. The Arnolds told him something serious had happened and asked him to come to their home immediately. Initially, Keith was reluctant as he was busy that morning, but John Arnold impressed upon him the urgency. "No, this is serious," John insisted, and so John S. Keith arrived at the Arnold's residence that morning to aid in figuring out what might have become of Dorothy. Upon entering Dorothy's bedroom, Keith and the family looked around for any clue or sign of departure. Interestingly, everything in Dorothy's room appeared normal and in place. All her clothing and personal belongings were there, except the outfit she had worn the day before. This indicated that Dorothy had not packed a bag or prepared to go away for long, at least not from what they could see. If Dorothy had planned a secret trip or run away, one might expect some clothes or suitcases missing, but there were none. The neatly hung dresses in her wardrobe and her toiletries undisturbed on the vanity suggested she intended to come home that day. However, Keith did find a couple of intriguing items during his search. In one of Dorothy's desk drawers, he discovered a bundle of personal letters bearing foreign postmarks. These letters were from abroad, which was unusual enough to note. They hinted that Dorothy had correspondence overseas, possibly from a friend or acquaintance traveling in Europe. Additionally, on the top of her desk lay 2 ocean liner brochures for transatlantic steamship voyages. These steamship folders caught Keith's attention immediately. Why was Dorothy interested in ocean liners? Could she have been planning an overseas trip? The presence of these brochures suggested she might have been daydreaming about or even arranging passage on a ship. It was an unusual find, but in the back of Keith's mind, it raised the possibility that Dorothy had contemplated going abroad or eloping. Keith also inspected the fireplace in Dorothy's room. There in the grate, he found the remnants of burned papers. He got down on his knees and carefully sifted through the ashes, but the papers were too charred to read. No writing was legible. John Arnold, Dorothy's brother, speculated that these ashes could be the remains of Dorothy's latest manuscripts. Perhaps the short story she had been working on titled Lotus Leaves. If Dorothy had burned her writing, it might indicate she was upset or trying to destroy something personal. Alternatively, perhaps she burned some correspondence. We do know Dorothy mailed at least 1 letter that day, to Gladys King, ironically handing it to her in person. But it's possible she had also disposed of some other letters or notes. The burned paper added another layer of mystery. Was Dorothy attempting to cover her tracks, or simply getting rid of a rejected story that caused her pain? After conducting this careful search and finding no clear evidence of Dorothy's whereabouts, John Keith took charge of the next steps. Without involving the police, he began a discreet investigation. Keith suggested checking local hospitals, clinics, and even city morgues, in case Dorothy had been in an accident or fallen ill somewhere. The family agreed, and Keith set out to canvass these places, starting in New York City and eventually extending to nearby cities like Boston and Philadelphia. One can imagine him, a concerned young lawyer in his overcoat and hat, walking somberly through the corridors of hospitals and the cold, stark row of morgue drawers, looking for any sign of the missing heiress. It must have been a grim task, peering at unconscious patients or unidentified bodies, hoping not to find a familiar face. And indeed, Keith found nothing. No Jane Doe matching Dorothy's description turned up in any of the hospitals or morgues he visited. Each day that passed with no news likely heightened the family's distress, even as they maintained outward silence about the matter. With their private search turning up no trace of Dorothy, the Arnolds realized they needed more professional help. They decided to hire the Pinkerton Detective Agency, a famous private detective firm of that era. The Pinkertons had a reputation for handling sensitive cases discreetly, which appealed to the publicly shy Arnolds. The Pinkerton detectives interviewed the family and were given all the details known. They quickly prepared and mailed out descriptive circulars about Dorothy to police departments and Pinkerton offices nationwide. These bulletins included Dorothy's physical description and what she was last seen wearing. Dorothy was described as about 5 foot, 4 inches tall, weighing 140 pounds, pretty and stylish, with brown hair in full pompadour style, a fashionable poof of hair, and wearing a well-tailored blue outfit in a blue dark velvet hat. The family offered a $1,000 reward, a large sum at the time, equivalent to tens of thousands today, or information leading to Dorothy's safe return. It's telling that even after Pinkerton detectives were on the case, the Arnold family still refrained from notifying the public authorities for several weeks. The New York City police, in fact, got Pinkerton's bulletin about Dorothy, but did not act because, officially, no family member had filed a missing persons report. Only on January 22nd, 1911, a full 6 weeks after Dorothy disappeared, did the Arnolds finally bring the police directly into the case. What caused the change? Likely, it was the dawning realization that all private efforts had failed and that continuing to keep the story under wraps was futile. Dorothy was nowhere to be found, and time was slipping by. Perhaps the Pinkertons advised that wider publicity might shake loose some leads. Francis Arnold reluctantly agreed to what he had dreaded: go public. On January 25th, 1911, Mr. Arnold, accompanied by Mr. Keith and some Pinkerton detectives, met with New York City's Deputy Police Commissioner, William J. Flynn. Commissioner Flynn urged that they immediately alert the press to get the widest possible attention on Dorothy's case. To a proud man like Francis Arnold, exposing his family's private anguish to the newspaper was almost as awful as the disappearance itself. He resisted the idea for 2 more days, but at last, realizing it was necessary, he agreed. That afternoon, he invited reporters to his office for a press conference. One can picture the scene in Francis Arnold's office that day. A cluster of newsmen in their suits and fedoras, notebook in hand, crowding around the desk of the somber, gray-faced Mr. Arnold. Perhaps the air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Francis Arnold, normally a composed and authoritative figure, appeared deeply distressed and gloomy before the press. With evident pain, he provided the details of Dorothy's disappearance. He described exactly what his daughter looked like and more that day. Emphasizing her character, he stated she was not secretive by nature and had never shown signs of mental disturbance or reasons to run away as far as he knew. He publicly offered the $1,000 reward and appealed for any information. During this interview, Francis Arnold also revealed his personal belief about Dorothy's fate. He said frankly that he believed she was dead. Specifically, he stated his theory that Dorothy had been attacked while walking home through Central Park and murdered, her body perhaps thrown into the reservoir there. This was a shocking statement. Imagine the reporters scribbling furiously as he spoke. The newspapers would later note how odd it was for a father so quickly assumed his beloved daughter had been killed, with no evidence. But from Mr. Arnold's perspective, 6 weeks of fruitless searching had likely drained away his hope. By then, he could scarcely imagine a happy outcome. I believe my daughter is dead. I believe she died the day she disappeared, or almost immediately afterwards, he told one paper bluntly. He added, the one theory to which I have always leaned is that she was kidnapped and made away with in a short time, elaborating that he thought some miscreant had seized Dorothy in the park and disposed of her body in the water. It was a grim pronouncement, delivered even as the search was officially just beginning to widen. The very next day, Dorothy Arnold's disappearance was front-page news. On January 26th, 1911, readers of the New York Times and other papers awoke to headlines about the missing heiress. The Times reported Mr. Arnold's belief that Dorothy might have run off to marry someone. As the police initially suspected, though he publicly discounted the idea of suicide or insanity. The press seized on every tantalizing detail: Dorothy's social standing, the mysterious circumstances, and the family's long silence. The story captivated the public. After all, this was a real-life mystery with all the elements of a novel. An attractive young woman, wealthy and educated, vanishing in broad daylight in the heart of New York City. The case had a human drama aspect as well. The image of her father, prostrated with grief and worry, and her mother on the verge of nervous collapse, as described in news accounts. Society pages that normally chronicle balls and engagements were now running sinister speculations about Dorothy's fate. And soon, more secrets about Dorothy's life would come tumbling into the open, splashed across the newspaper for all to read. In the days and weeks following the public revelation of Dorothy's disappearance, the press and police began digging into her background for clues. Almost immediately, startling secrets about Dorothy's personal life emerged, shedding new light on what might have happened to her. The most significant revelation concerned a man named George S. Grissom, Jr., and a clandestine romance that Dorothy had kept hidden from her family. George Grissom, Jr. was a 42-year-old bachelor from a wealthy Pittsburgh family. He was an engineer by education, though apparently not working actively, and was something of a genteel bon vivant. Described as a plump, sideburns man who still lived with his aging parents, Grissom was indulged by his family. One report quipped that his doting mother even picked out his shirts for him. Despite these less than flattering portrayals, Grissom had a charm that appealed to Dorothy. They had met a few years earlier, likely around 1907 or 1908, when Dorothy was attending Bryn Mawr University, and Grissom was vacationing in the East. Some sources say they met in Florida or at a seaside resort, but Bryn Mawr is also cited. At some point, Dorothy and Junior Grissom fell in love, enough that they privately considered themselves engaged to be married. This relationship was kept secret from Dorothy's family. Given Grissom's age, nearly 17 years her senior, and perhaps his reputation, he had had a previous engagement to another heiress that was broken off under scandalous circumstances the night before the wedding. Frances Arnold would likely have disapproved. Indeed, once the newspapers learned of Grissom, they noted that Dorothy's father had staunchly opposed the match. But Dorothy clearly had strong feelings for Grissom and continued to see him without her family's knowledge. This demonstrates Dorothy's capacity for keeping parts of her life compartmentalized and private. The press uncovered the most scandalous details just a few months before her disappearance in September 1910. Dorothy Arnold had lied to her parents about going to visit college friends in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In reality, she went to Boston to spend a secret week in the company of George Grissom Jr. She even went as far as to pawn some of her jewelry to finance this illicit trip, indicating how determined she was to see him. Dorothy and Grissom stayed together at the upscale Hotel Essex in Boston. openly dining and sightseeing as a couple during that week. By all accounts, they appeared blissfully happy at the time, looking animated and happy as they toured the city. It was highly improper by the standards of the day for an unmarried woman to travel alone to meet a man and stay in a hotel with him. So one can imagine the uproar when this information came out. The Arnold family was reportedly stunned and mortified to learn of Dorothy's Boston escapade. They had truly no idea that Dorothy was carrying on such a serious romance behind their backs. Where was George Griscom when Dorothy went missing? It turns out that at the time of her disappearance in December, Griscom was traveling in Europe with his parents. In fact, he was staying in Florence, Italy. When Dorothy failed to return home, one of the first things John S. Keith did once he learned about Griscom was cable Griscom in Italy on December 16, 1910. The cable read, "Dorothy Arnold missing, family prostrated. Cable Garvin Com, the law firm, if you know anything of her whereabouts." Upon receiving this alarming message at his hotel, Griscom was observed to become very agitated. According to some witnesses, he muttered something like, "Arnold is making serious trouble," as he absorbed the news. Griscom immediately sent a reply telegram stating, "No, absolutely nothing, Junior." This was the first denial of any knowledge about what happened to Dorothy. Despite his reply, one can imagine Griscom's mind racing. He was far away, and his sweetheart had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Over the following days and weeks, more cable exchanges took place. The Arnolds, via their lawyer, or the Pinkertons, asked if Dorothy had possibly come to Europe to find Griscom, or if he had any clues at all. Griscom kept insisting he knew nothing, and Dorothy had not appeared in Florence or contacted him. In early January 1911, Dorothy's mother, Mary, and her brother, John Jr., took a drastic step. They decided to sail to Europe themselves to confront Griscom in person. This shows both how desperate they were for answers, and perhaps a lingering suspicion that Griscom might be hiding something. They tracked him down at a hotel in Italy. According to newspaper reports, the meeting was dramatic. John Arnold Jr. got into a physical altercation with Griscom in a Florence hotel suite. Some accounts claim that John actually struck Griscom and had to wrestle him to obtain a packet of letters that Dorothy had written to Griscom. It was said that John effectively forced Griscom to hand over Dorothy's love letters, perhaps suspecting they held clues. Headlines back home even blared things like, "Griscom licked by young Arnold in foreign hotel," suggesting a brawl occurred. Griscom, for his part, maintained that he was just as distraught and as mystified as the Arnolds. He vowed that he loved Dorothy and even said that he intended to marry her if she were found. He denied having any involvement in her disappearance. Mary Arnold and John Jr. returned to New York with Dorothy's letters from Griscom. Among those letters was one particularly poignant correspondence that soon became public. It included a letter Dorothy had written to Griscom not long before she vanished, and in it, she revealed her inner turmoil. "McClure's has turned me down," she wrote. referring to her unsuccessful attempt to get her story published. Failure stares me in the face. All I see ahead is a long road with no turning. These words painted a picture of Dorothy in a state of despondency, feeling as though her aspirations were crumbling. The most haunting line was, "Mother will always think an accident has happened." This particular sentence sent chills through those who read it. It implied that Dorothy might have been contemplating doing something that her mother would interpret as an accident. In retrospect, many thought this was a hint that Dorothy was considering taking her own life or disappearing deliberately, leaving her family to assume it was an accident. The fact that Dorothy could write that line suggests she was at least entertaining a plan that would result in her being gone, one way or another. Dorothy's letters also showed that despite her generally sunny disposition, she carried a burden of sadness or frustration inside. The public, who had seen her described as a happy, spirited young woman devoted to her social life, were now introduced to a more melancholy side of Dorothy. She had dreams that were not materializing. Her writing career seemed hopeless in her eyes, and her family belittled her ambitions. She also faced a romantic situation where the man she loved was not accepted by her family, and he was far away. Dorothy's life, while privileged, was not without emotional trials. Interestingly, around the same time, a clerk at a steamship ticket agency in New York came forward with a striking memory. After seeing Dorothy's face in the newspaper, this ticket agent reported that on the very day Dorothy disappeared, on December 12th, a young woman matching her description had come into the office to inquire about booking passage on a steamer to sail to the West Indies. This detail, if true, adds a fascinating twist. It suggests Dorothy might have been gathering information for a sudden trip, possibly an escape or elopement plan. The agent said the woman asked about cruises to the Caribbean and left after getting some information. John Keith took this seriously, and combined with the steamship brochures found in her room and those foreign postmarked letters, he theorized that perhaps Dorothy had planned to elope or run off with someone, maybe even Griscom. However, skeptics pointed out that Dorothy hadn't packed anything and only had $25 on her. So unless she had hidden preparations, such an unplanned voyage seemed unlikely. Still, the ticket agent's story tantalized investigators as a possible clue that Dorothy had considered a sea voyage. By late January and early February 1911, Dorothy's disappearance was the talk of the town. Newspaper coverage went international, with stories about the missing heiress appearing as far away as Europe. The media frenzy was intense. Journalists were camped outside the Arnold home, and any shred of information or rumors found its way into print. The public learned about every theory and whisper, from Dorothy's writing rejections to the Boston trip with Griscom, from her letters of despair to the supposed steamship inquiries. Society gossips speculated about whether Dorothy might have secretly wed someone, or if a scorned suitor had harmed her, or if she had been pregnant. The Arnold family, who had so feared scandal, now had to endure the full glare of publicity. It was undoubtedly humiliating and painful for them, but they persisted in trying everything possible to find Dorothy. As weeks turned into months and then years, Dorothy's case remained unsolved. However, it continued to generate periodic bursts of headlines whenever a new lead or theory surfaced. Over time, a handful of major theories about Dorothy's fate came to dominate discussions. Each theory had its proponents and its peculiar bits of supporting evidence, yet none could be proven. In the next section, we will delve into these theories one by one, examining them with a calm and open mind. As we do so, we'll maintain our gentle pace, considering each possibility in the same way one might turn a mysterious object slowly in hand, peering at it from all angles. Remember, in a case this old and puzzling, nothing is certain, and we tread lightly on the realm of speculation. Before analyzing the theories, let's briefly look at how the investigation in public interest continued after the initial press storm. Once Dorothy's story was out, thousands of letters and tips poured in. Strangers claimed to have seen her in various places, and some even impersonated her. Each lead had to be checked, and many led to dead ends or hoaxes. For example, in 1911, the year following her disappearance, Dorothy's father, Francis, received a postcard that read, "I am safe," and was signed Dorothy. This message, arriving out of the blue, must have given the family a jolt of hope or confusion. Francis Arnold examined the handwriting and remarked that it was eerily similar to his daughter's. Can you imagine the mix of emotions? Hope that it truly was from Dorothy, yet suspicion that it might be a cruel prank. Ultimately, he concluded that it was likely a hoax, perhaps some mischievous person impersonating Dorothy's hand. He considered it a cruel joke and dismissed it, as nothing further came of it. We can sense the heartache behind that decision. To believe it was real and yet have no way to find her would be torture, so perhaps it was emotionally safer to treat it as a fake. Around 1914, a bizarre incident made headlines. In Los Angeles, a woman going by the name Ella Nevin claimed that she was Dorothy Arnold, living under an assumed identity. This woman told people, "If you don't believe I'm Dorothy Arnold, ask my sister Marjorie. She will know why my father doesn't answer my letters." It was a very specific thing to say, and it piqued the interest of authorities. If true, it suggests Dorothy had left because of some family rift and was trying to communicate. However, upon investigation, Ella Nevins was revealed not to be Dorothy after all, just one of many disturbed or attention-seeking individuals who falsely claimed to be the missing heiress. There were countless such claims and supposed sighting of Dorothy over the years, from points all over the United States and even abroad. The police dutifully followed up many of them. For instance, even as late as 1935, on the 25th anniversary of her disappearance, the NYPD received a tip that a woman resembling Dorothy was seen on a Manhattan street corner. Detectives quietly watched that corner for hours, scanning faces in the crowd, an almost forlorn exercise given that Dorothy would have been 49 years old by then. Unsurprisingly, they did not find her. Another thread in the investigation concerned any unknown men or enemies in Dorothy's life. The family insisted Dorothy had no serious suitors besides Griscom, and no known enemies or unsavory acquaintances. She was well liked and had a normal social life. So there was no obvious suspects who might want to harm her or whisk her away. Still, police considered the possibility of foul play by a stranger. They looked into known criminals or kidnappers in the city. But typically, a kidnapper's motive would be ransom, and no ransom demand ever came to the Arnolds. The absence of communication from any abductors made the kidnapping theory less straightforward, though not impossible, as we'll discuss. One concrete action the police took, at Mr. Arnold's urging, was to search the Central Park Reservoir, once it thawed in the spring. Since it had been frozen on the day Dorothy vanished, divers or crew dragged the lake and reservoir to check for a body, but nothing was found. This both relieved and frustrated the family, relieved that no corpse turned up, yet frustrated that they were no closer to answers. The case attracted some unscrupulous characters as well. Over the years, several confessions emerged from people claiming to know Dorothy's fate, but each of these was either debunked or unsubstantiated. One notable instance was in April 1914. The police raided a place in the Pittsburgh area dubbed the House of Mystery, which turned out to be an illegal maternity hospital where abortions were performed secretly. The doctor in charge, C.C. Meredith, was arrested. During the investigation, Dr. Meredith alleged that Dorothy Arnold had been one of his patients who died under anesthetics, and that her body had been incinerated in the furnace. This sensational claim made headlines. Some speculated that Dorothy, if she indeed had been pregnant, perhaps from her Boston trip with Griscom, might have gone to this clandestine clinic under an alias and met a tragic end there. However, Frances Arnold swiftly and angrily dismissed Meredith's story as ridiculous. There was no hard evidence to verify the claim. The doctor did not have records or proof tying Dorothy to his clinic beyond his words, and he may have been trying to deflect blame for all the missing women associated with his practice. The police could not confirm Dorothy's presence there, and thus, this lead, while darkly intriguing, remains unproven. Then, in 1916, came another dramatic claim. A man serving time in prison, a convicted felon, confessed that he had been paid $250 by a wealthy man to dispose of Dorothy Arnold's body. This convict, named Edward Glenoris, according to newspaper reports, said that a stranger who looked like a well-to-do gentleman hired him and a partner to take a woman's body from a New York hotel, put it in a trunk, and bury it in the cellar of a house in suburban New Jersey or New York. The implication was that Dorothy might have died or been killed at a hotel, and someone, maybe a lover or an accomplice of hers, wanted to hide the evidence quietly. The convict's story even hinted the rich man resembled George Griscom Jr., casting suspicions in that direction without naming him. This was explosive news. The authority did check out the details as best they could, and they excavated several cellars of houses where Glenoris claimed the body might be, hoping to find remains. Each dig, however, yielded nothing. No trace of a buried trunk or human remains turned up. Ultimately, authorities doubted the veracity of the story, Frances Arnold once more called it utter nonsense and the ramblings of a man seeking attention. The convict later recanted parts of his tale, but no charges were ever filed stemming from it. By the early 1920s, after a decade of fruitless searching and relentless media coverage, Dorothy's case gradually turned cold. Dorothy's father, Francis Arnold, died in 1922, without ever learning his daughter's fate. Her mother, Mary, died in 1928. Both of them, in their wills, made a point to state that no provision was made for Dorothy because they were satisfied she was not alive. This was essentially a legal acknowledgement of her death, even though no death certificate ever existed for Dorothy. Despite that, Dorothy's mother, Mary, was said to have never completely given up hope in her heart that Dorothy might be alive somewhere. It's as if Mary Arnold couldn't bear the absolute finality, clinging to that mother's intuition, or perhaps wishful thinking that her daughter might still return one day. Dorothy's younger siblings lived out their lives in the shadow of the mystery. Her sister, Marjorie, married and later divorced, eventually moving to France and even dropping the surname Arnold to avoid the notoriety associated with it. In later years, Dorothy's extended family, nieces and nephews who never knew her, would mention how the older generations rarely spoke of Dorothy, as it remained a painful subject. By the mid-20th century, Dorothy Arnold's disappearance had become a kind of legend, often cited in compilations of unsolved mysteries and inspiring fictional stories about women who vanished. Throughout it all, the public's fascination with the case endured. It was frequently referred to as New York's oldest cold case, or an example of a baffling disappearance that baffled even the most brilliant minds. As one author noted, it was a disappearance which had from the beginning no standard in rationality, being logically impenetrable, an impossible problem for reason and analytical power. In other words, no matter how one analyzed it, something just didn't add up neatly. Now, with all the facts and context laid out, let's turn our attention to the major theories of what might have happened to Dorothy Arnold. We will explore each possibility in depth, considering the supporting facts and the counter-arguments, all in our calm and measured way. Over the years, investigators, family members, and amateur sleuths have proposed several key theories to explain Dorothy Arnold's disappearance. Each theory offers a possible answer, yet each also has its flaws or unanswered questions. As we discuss them, we will do so gently, acknowledging the sensitive nature of some scenarios. We will also remember that these theories are speculative. None have been proven. In the absence of certainty, we open our minds to each possibility, examining it as one might examine a rare, perplexing butterfly under glass, carefully, respectfully, and without sudden movements. Theory 1. Abduction and murder. The Central Park attack theory. The theory that Dorothy was attacked and killed by a stranger on her way home was the one her father favored and feared from the start. According to this scenario, Dorothy may have been kidnapped or assaulted while walking through Central Park, and then murdered with her bodies concealed afterward. Francis Arnold imagined the predator seizing Dorothy on a lonely path, rendering her helpless. and disposing of her remains, perhaps by throwing her into the park's reservoir or lake. It's a chilling idea, and Mr. Arnold spoke of it as though it were practically a certainty in his mind. He even got the authorities to search the park's waters once they thawed. Publicly, he maintained until his dying day that Dorothy had likely been made away with in a short time by an unknown assailant. What evidence or reasoning supports this theory? For one, Dorothy truly did vanish in a very short window of time, and a violent act is one way to account for such a sudden disappearance. New York City was a bustling metropolis, but Central Park had its secluded spots where crimes could occur without immediate notice. If Dorothy took a quieter route through the park around mid-afternoon, it's conceivable that someone with ill intent, a robber or worse, might have targeted a woman walking alone. Dorothy was carrying expensive clothes and purchased a book. She likely had a bit of jewelry on as well. She could have been seen as an attractive target for a mugging. If a struggle ensued and Dorothy was incapacitated or worse, the perpetrator might have hurriedly gotten rid of the evidence. Another point. December days are short. By 4:30 or 5 p.m., it would have been quite dark. If Dorothy was still out as dusk fell, the park would have grown more shadowy and empty of law-abiding strollers. Also at that time in 1910, there were fewer people out in winter compared to summer. The cold might keep casual visitors away, possibly leaving stretches of path isolated. All it would take is a terrible encounter in a quiet moment. However, there are strong arguments against the abduction murder theory as well. Dorothy was young and in good health. She wasn't frail. It would have required a fairly determined assailant, or more than one, to subdue her quickly, especially if she had any chance to cry out or resist. No one reported hearing screams or seeing a scuffle in Central Park that day. No witnesses came forward saying they saw a woman being dragged or attacked. And remember, Dorothy disappeared in daytime around 2 p.m. in Midtown Manhattan. The park entrance is likely used at 59th Street, is a very busy area. It's not as if she walked into a deep forest. Even within the park, some passerby or carriage driver might have been around. It would be a bold criminal indeed to assault someone in such conditions and leave no trace. Moreover, no body was ever found. If the idea was she was dumped in the reservoir, one might expect her remains to surface eventually or be discovered during later routine maintenance or dredging, but nothing was discovered in over a century. Additionally, usually a murderer's motive in such a random attack would be robbery or worse. If robbery, Dorothy's purse or items would have been taken. But since we don't know what exactly she had on her, it's hard to tell if any possessions turned up elsewhere. There wasn't any reports of her belongings being found and abandoned. If a more nefarious crime, it's just speculation. Police did not have any specific suspect or known criminals tied to such a deed. It was simply a vague possibility in a city that certainly had its share of crimes. Because of these uncertainties, many investigators felt that while an assault by a stranger was not impossible, it was somewhat unlikely given the lack of evidence. Dorothy's father clung to it, perhaps because it was the most straightforward tragic narrative. An innocent girl victimized by a fiend, with no blame on Dorothy herself. It absolved the family and Dorothy of any scandal, making her purely a martyr of random violence. Frances Arnold might have found that easier to accept publicly than theories that suggested Dorothy had run off or done something untoward. We hold this theory in mind. It is one path the story could have taken. In the quiet of the night, one can almost conjure a ghostly image of Dorothy walking underneath the bare trees and gas lamps of Central Park, a footstep quickening behind her. But we hasten to reassure ourselves that this is only conjecture, and perhaps we can gently set this frightening theory aside unless more evidence ever appears. Theory 2. Suicide or self-harm. The despairing escape theory. Another theory is that Dorothy, overwhelmed by personal troubles, took her own life or otherwise met a self-induced end on the day she disappeared. This idea gained traction as Dorothy's emotional state came to light through her letters and the testimony of George Griscom. Recall those haunting words from her letters. All I see ahead is a long road with no turning. Mother will always think an accident has happened. To many, this reads like a veiled farewell, as if Dorothy was contemplating suicide, but wanted her mother to think it was an accident rather than an intentional act. What might have driven Dorothy to such despair? The factors often cited include her humiliation over her failed writing career, the constant mocking by her family over her aspirations, and possibly heartache or frustration over her situation with Griscom. She was denied independence. Her creative outlet was met with rejection, and her romantic life was constrained by her family's disapproval. That's a lot of pressure on a young woman who perhaps felt increasingly hopeless or stifled. George Griscom Jr., for one, reportedly feared that Dorothy might have killed herself. After all, he knew of her disappointments. She had written him about the magazine's rejection and her feelings of failure. He also knew Dorothy could be intensely emotional. Griscom and others noted that Dorothy had been very sensitive about the rejection of her stories. If on December 12th, she had in fact received another rejection, perhaps of her story Lotus Leaves, it could have been the last straw. We don't know for certain if one arrived that day, but given that she had mailed one out weeks prior, it's possible she heard back by then. The burned papers in her fireplace might indeed have been that rejected manuscript, which, if true, paints a poignant scene. Dorothy burning her dreams in the hearth of the morning she left, a symbolic act of despair. If Dorothy decided to end her life, how and where might she have done it? One hypothesis was that she might have jumped into the water somewhere. One newspaper, the New York World, drew a parallel to a story Dorothy knew. Griscom's own cousin Andrew had tragically leapt from an ocean liner to his death years earlier after a romantic disappointment. Dorothy had been acquainted with that cousin, and some wondered if the dramatic notion of a fatal leap might have struck her mind as a solution if she ever felt utterly forlorn. Indeed, the steamship folders on her desk, in her inquiry about a West Indies cruise, could be interpreted not as plans to run away, but as plans to board a ship and vanish. In those days, if someone jumped overboard on an ocean voyage, it was quite plausible their body would never be discovered, and a person could disappear without a trace. However, as journalists pointed out, No passengers were reported missing from any ocean liners around the time Dorothy vanished. Ocean liners kept passenger lists, and such an incident would likely have been noted, but there were other vessels that did not maintain such strict records. One suggestion was the Fall River Line that left New York every evening for New England, a kind of overnight ferry for which tickets were bought anonymously and passenger names weren't recorded. If Dorothy had boarded one of these under an assumed name or simply as a cash-paying passenger, she could have slipped off the deck into the dark waters of Long Island Sound during the night, and no one would know until she failed to appear in the morning, at which point she'd just be an unidentified missing passenger. It's a somber image. Dorothy standing by the rail of a steamship at night, the light of the city receding, and making a tragic decision. Yet again, we have no evidence that this occurred. It is only a conjecture drawn from the fact that it was possible and that other people had unfortunately done similar things. Another method of suicide could have been using some kind of poison or other means in a rented room or quiet place, but that would likely leave a body to be found. No unidentified body matching Dorothy turned up in New York or elsewhere in that time frame, despite John Keith searching extensively. It's possible she could have gone to another city, Philadelphia or maybe Boston, but again, there's no solid lead supporting that in the records. There's also the psychological puzzle. Those who saw Dorothy on the day she vanished said she did not seem depressed or upset at all. She was cheerful with Gladys King, enjoying chocolates and buying a new book, and anticipating her sister's party. People who plan suicide can sometimes hide their pain, it's true, or even experience a kind of lightness once their decision is made. But it struck many as inconsistent that she would cheerfully buy a book and candy if she planned to die in a matter of hours. Was she bothered with purchase only to likely discard it? Some argue that maybe she bought the book as a decoy to appear normal, or even as a gift for someone she intended to see. There are layers of speculations here. Others feel that her normal behavior indicates she had no such plan that day. It's also worth noting that Dorothy left no suicide note, aside from possibly that line in the letter to Griscom, which wasn't a direct note. People in 1910 were aware that suicides often left notes. The absence of a clear goodbye message or instructions, and she was a writer who might have been inclined to articulate her feelings, leaves a gap in this theory. We must handle this theory with care, as it touches on Dorothy's inner suffering. It's heartbreaking to think she might have felt so hopeless. The family lawyer, John S. Keith, eventually came to believe in the suicide theory. He reportedly shared that belief only years later, after Dorothy's parents had passed away, perhaps to avoid causing them additional pain while alive. Keith had seen the hints, the letter, the rejections, her secret postbox, and perhaps other subtle signs known only to him. In his mind, Dorothy likely ended her life due to the strain she was under. And yet, because no evidence of body or definite act was found, this theory remains an open-ended question. If Dorothy did choose her own exit, she managed to do it in a way that the world never found her. A final act of disappearing that perhaps she thought would spare her family's feelings. As we consider this possibility, we remember Dorothy not as a victim of violence, but as a deeply sad figure who might have felt this was her only escape. we extend compassion to that image of Dorothy, hoping that if this was her fate, she found the peace she was seeking. Yet, we also hope it was not so, clinging to the possibility that maybe Dorothy had more will to live and thus perhaps met a different fate. Theory 3. Fatal accident or botched procedure, the tragic misadventure theory. Another theory is that Dorothy's disappearance was the result of a tragic accident or a clandestine medical procedure gone wrong. This encompasses a few related ideas: that Dorothy might have died as a result of an illegal abortion, or some other medical emergency, or even an accidental death, and those around her hid the body to avoid scandal or legal troubles. The illegal abortion hypothesis gained traction due to multiple factors. Dorothy had been romantically involved with George Griscom Jr., and they had spent a week together in Boston. It is not hard to imagine that during that intimate trip, Dorothy could have become pregnant. In 1910, an out-of-wedlock pregnancy in a high society young woman would be scandalous and devastating to her and her family's reputation. If Dorothy found herself in that situation, she might have felt desperate to resolve it discreetly. Abortion was illegal at the time, but it was nonetheless sought by many women in dire straits, often at great risk. If Dorothy indeed was pregnant, we have no proof of this, it's purely speculative, she could have chosen to visit an abortionist in secret. She might not have confided in her family, clearly not, given their attitudes, so she may have turned to Griscom or a friend for help. Griscom, being older and somewhat worldly, might have known of a doctor who performed such procedures quietly. The mention in Dorothy's November letter that a package was delivered to her on Thanksgiving Day in Washington, D.C., when she was visiting relatives that surprised her family, has led some to guess that perhaps Griscom sent her money or information then. What was in that package? We don't know, but one speculation is it could have contained cash or instructions for addressing a possible pregnancy. This is reading between lines of a speculative article, but it shows how people try to connect the dots. Now consider Dr. C.C. Meredith's claim in 1914. He ran that illegal clinic in Pennsylvania and alleged Dorothy died under his care and was cremated in his cellar furnace. If Dorothy had indeed needed such a procedure, she might have traveled under an alias to a clinic away from New York to minimize recognition. Pittsburgh's vicinity is notable because Griscom was from Pittsburgh. Maybe he had knowledge of a doctor there. If Dorothy died in the process, the doctors and any accomplice would have every incentive to dispose of her body and never report it, to avoid persecution for manslaughter or illegal abortion. If this happened, it would very neatly explain why no trace of her was ever found. A cremation in a private furnace would obliterate evidence. However, we must note that Dr. Meredith's story was never corroborated. He didn't produce evidence, such as personal items of Dorothy's, or a witness who had seen her at his clinic. It could have been a grim fabrication or a bid for notoriety. Dorothy's father branded it absolutely untrue, though one might expect him to say that regardless, given the sheer horror of the claim and its blow to the family's honor. There were indeed several women missing who had passed through Meredith's clinic, according to news reports, so he was linked to other tragedies. Dorothy might have been one of them, or the doctor could have been using her famous name to excuse other deaths, implying, oh, one of them was that missing heiress, that's why she's missing, even if it wasn't true. Even outside the abortion scenario, some have theorized Dorothy might have suffered an accident or medical emergency, and those present hid her body out of fear. For instance, perhaps she met up with someone like a friend or acquaintance after leaving Gladys, and maybe at that person's apartment something happened. She could have slipped and fatally hit her head, or overdosed on something, or any number of mishaps. Panicked, the person might have gotten help to remove her body and conceal it. This is largely conjecture, but it's sometimes considered under the umbrella of accidental death covered up by others. The convict's confession about moving a body in a trunk to bury in a cellar aligns with this general notion. Then Dorothy died under a private setting and was surreptitiously buried. If we take that convict's tale at face value, it even provides a mechanism. A rich man implied to look like Griscom, paying underworld figures to eliminate evidence. That overlaps with the abortion scenario if Griscom or someone wealthy was involved in arranging it. Alternatively, it could insinuate Dorothy died of some cause in Griscom's presence, and he panicked. But since Griscom was verifiably in Europe, he could not physically have been in New York on December 12th, unless Dorothy's death happened earlier or later, which doesn't match known last sightings. We can see how this theory can become a web of what-ifs. Its strength is that it explains her total disappearance if those responsible thoroughly disposed of her remains. It also dovetails with the notion that Dorothy's pride and need for secrecy might drive her to a risky solution for a pregnancy or other personal crisis. The weakness is that it relies on hearsay, like the convict in Meredith, and stains Dorothy's memory with a scandal that might not be true at all. From a gentle perspective, if this is what befell Dorothy, it portrays her story as doubly tragic. First, the misfortune of a complication, be it pregnancy or something else, and then her life ending not in a peaceful way, but on an illicit operating table or the like, followed by an indignity of her remains being hidden. It's a distressing thought. We tread carefully here, understanding why her family vehemently rejected this scenario. It's gruesome and heartbreaking. Theory 4. Voluntary disappearance. The new life theory. The last major theory posits that Dorothy chose to disappear and start a new life under a different identity. Could it be that Dorothy did not die at all on that December day, but rather seized the opportunity to escape the confines of her old life and reinvent herself somewhere far away? This theory has certain romantic appeal and has been seriously considered by some historians in more recent years. The idea is that Dorothy, being an intelligent and resourceful woman, may have been dissatisfied enough with her life to stage her own vanishing act. She had secrets, like her affair with Griscom, her hidden writing pursuits, which shows she was capable of covert planning. Perhaps she quietly squirreled away money, beyond the $25 note. Maybe she had jewelry or other funds we didn't know about, and made arrangements to go to a place where no one knew her. The steamship brochures in the inquiry about cruises could indicate she researched ways to go abroad incognito. In an era with no social security numbers, no digital footprint, and only rudimentary identification documents, a person truly could drop out of sight more easily than today. They could simply adopt a new name, move to a new city or country, and unless someone recognized them, they could melt into the crowd. If Dorothy had been utterly unhappy, feeling oppressed by her family's control, humiliated by her setbacks, and perhaps doubting she could ever get the life she wanted as Dorothy Arnold, she might have seen disappearing as a radical form of liberation. She could potentially pursue writing or other work without the weight of her family's name or expectation. She might even have intended to meet up with someone, maybe Griscom or maybe not. Griscom did return to America and never found her, so unless they planned to rendezvous and it fell through, he doesn't seem to have known of such plan. One tantalizing aspect of this theory is Dorothy's mother's enduring belief that Dorothy was alive. Mary Arnold, until she died in 1928, supposedly did not believe her daughter was dead. Was that simply a grieving mother's refusal to accept loss? Or did she have some intuition or subtle clue that Dorothy might have run off? It's mentioned in one source that in later years, a family story held that maybe the family did find out something, but kept it quiet. We have no evidence of that, but it shows how one can wonder if the family eventually suspected Dorothy left of her own accord, and maybe even came to terms with it privately, given the phrasing in the wills that they made no provision as she was not alive. Legally declaring her dead might have just been practical, even if Mary hoped otherwise in her heart. We do have that one instance of a woman claiming to be Dorothy in Los Angeles, the Ella Nevins case, which, while false, indicates how plausible it seemed to people that Dorothy could have been hiding under another name. There were also periodic letters and rumored messages from Dorothy, like postcards saying, "I am safe." If any of those were genuine, it would indeed suggest she left on purpose. Sylvia Pedham, a historian who wrote about Dorothy's case, mentioned that she initially thought Dorothy died in an abortion, but later changed her mind to lean towards the idea Dorothy walked away and started anew. She noted how relatively simple it was at that time to vanish if one was determined, citing how altering one's hairstyle and name could suffice in an age with no photo ID or interconnected databases. Let's imagine how Dorothy might have executed such a plan. She could have arranged for any needed travel documents or tickets under another name ahead of time, maybe using that post office box to receive them. On December 12th, after parting ways with Gladys, instead of heading straight home, perhaps she went to a train station, say Grand Central or Penn Station, and caught an afternoon train out of the city to someplace like Philadelphia, Boston, or even farther. With holiday travel, a young woman alone might not have raised eyebrows. Alternatively, maybe she crossed by ferry to New Jersey and took a train going west or south. If she had the West Indies in mind, she might have planned to leave on a ship leaving from another port. The lack of luggage is an issue, but perhaps she had shipped a trunk ahead of time to some destination or planned to buy things anew. If she had a confidant, even someone like a maid or friend who never revealed the secret, that person might have helped her prepare. If Dorothy did slip away intentionally, it begs the question, why did she never contact her family or return even after years passed? For someone so close to her family, on the surface at least, it would be a cold act to let her parents suffer indefinitely, unless something prevented her from contacting them later, like shame, or perhaps she indeed married and cut ties to avoid detection, or she really died shortly after starting this new life anyways. Could Dorothy have been so resolute as to sever all ties? It's hard to fathom, but not impossible. Some missing persons cases have indeed turned out to be voluntary, with the individuals living out their life quietly under a new identity. One of Dorothy's nieces, when interviewed a century later, pointed out pragmatically that in those days disappearing could be as easy as walking away and not coming back, in terms of bureaucratic obstacles. She acknowledged it as a possibility, although the family tended to shy from speculation publicly. The counterpoint to this theory include the fact that Dorothy left behind pretty much everything she owned and was known for: clothes, jewelry, personal effects. If she planned to start over, one might think she would have prepared better to take resources. $25 was not much to begin anew. Perhaps she had more cash, secretly from pawning jewels. We know she's done that in the past for her Boston trip. But aside from that, if she was alone, it would be daunting. Also, Dorothy had a beloved extended family and plenty of friends. Disappearing permanently is a drastic step unless she felt truly cornered or suffocated by her environment. However, given that none of the other theories are proven, and Dorothy's case remains unsolved, the new life theory cannot be dismissed. It remains an enticing scenario that preserves Dorothy as alive rather than a victim. If true, Dorothy Arnold could have lived under another name, possibly married someone else, had children, and those descendants might be unaware of their connection to her. Indeed, one of Dorothy's surviving relatives mused how interesting it would be if DNA could one day find a match for Dorothy somewhere, as a way of solving the mystery. In the age of genetic genealogy, that's not outlandish. Though given Dorothy likely had no children, or her siblings' lines would be the ones to test against, it's uncertain. In weighting this theory, we conjure a vision of Dorothy stepping onto a train platform or a ship deck, heart pounding with a mix of fear and liberation. The wind might catch her veil as she looks forward to an unknown horizon, not back at the city she left. If she indeed pulled off this grand disappearing act, one hopes she found happiness, or at least peace, in her chosen anonymity. It's bittersweet thought. On one hand, it means she broke free to live life on her own terms. On the other, it means she knowingly inflicted years of pain on those who loved her. People are complex, and perhaps Dorothy had reached a point where her thoughts of her family would eventually accept her absence, and that was for the best. We've explored the main hypotheses: murder, suicide, accidental death or cover-up, involuntary escape. Each is plausible in its own way and problematic in another. The lack of conclusive evidence keeps the debate open. In such an old mystery, it's possible the truth is something not neatly encompassed by any of these theories, or a combination of them. For instance, one could imagine a scenario where Dorothy intended to run away, voluntarily disappearing, but met with foul play afterwards. Or perhaps she attempted to run away, but fell into an accident. There are myriad permutations. However, given all that was uncovered, many who study the case find themselves drawn to one of the above four explanations. It's like trying to fit the pieces of a puzzle that has a few pieces missing. You can see some patterns, but the full picture eludes you. We must keep in mind that those who knew Dorothy or investigated at that time had their biases. Francis Arnold might never accept a scenario that tarnished his daughter's virtue, like pregnancy or running away, hence his insistence on kidnapping. John Keith might have had insights pointing to suicide, but kept them quiet during the parents' lifetime to spare them. Griscom might have concealed things to protect Dorothy's honor or his own. The press sensationalized aspects to sell in papers. Despite all the swirling theories, one reality stands. Dorothy Arnold was never found. Not a trace, not a confirmed sighting, not a body identified as hers. It is as if she evaporated on that December day. This enduring unknown is what keeps people pondering the case, even in modern times. It is the reason you can still find articles, podcasts, and discussions about Dorothy's fate so many decades later. Now, having thoroughly examined Dorothy's life, her disappearance, and theories around it, let's gently conclude our narrative. We will reflect on the aftermath and what Dorothy Arnold's story means to us as an enduring mystery, all while maintaining the calm and soothing tone that befits this late hour of storytelling. We have wandered together through the cobblestone streets of old New York, traced the delicate threads of Dorothy Arnold's life, and explored the many paths her fate might have taken. It has been a long and gentle journey, much like an extensive bedtime story that seeks not to alarm, but to immerse, and finally, to ease one into rest. As we reach the conclusion, we find ourselves in a place of contemplation. Dorothy's story does not end with a neat resolution, but rather with a soft question mark that has lingered for over a century. In the wake of Dorothy's disappearance, her family's life was forever changed. The Arnolds had to carry on without their beloved daughter and sister, enduring not only personal grief, but public scrutiny. They did what they could to find answers, spending what some estimate to be over $1 million in the long course of private investigations, reward, and travel. Yet those answers eluded them. Frances and Mary Arnold went to their graves without the closure they desperately sought. In their final acts of estate planning, they acknowledged Dorothy's absence by effectively considering her gone. But in their hearts, one imagines a glimmer of hope, or the ache of uncertainty persisted. Dorothy's siblings and extended family, for the most part, maintained dignified silence about the tragedy in later years, choosing not to fan the flames of speculation. The pain and perhaps embarrassment of it all led them to be reticent. In fact, within the family, Dorothy's story became something respectfully tiptoed around, a ghost in the family history that everyone was aware of, but few spoke openly of. This too is a kind of gentle handling. Sometimes families cope by letting a painful mystery remain in peace, rather than constantly picking at it. For the public, in the realm of true crime history, Dorothy Arnold's case stands as an enduring enigma, often cited as one of the most baffling unsolved missing person cases in American history. People remain intrigued because it challenges our assumptions. How could a woman vanish from the middle of Manhattan in daylight without anyone noticing something's amiss? How could all the best detectives of the time, extensive media coverage, and widespread public awareness fail to turn up a single concrete clue? It reminds us that life can hold secrets that defy explanation, and that sometimes all the facts don't add up to the truth, like pieces from different puzzles jumbled together. In pondering Dorothy's fate, modern perspectives sometimes shed new light. Some who revisit the case consider forensic advancements or social context, that weren't available back then. For example, today we might say, what about checking handwriting of that postcard more scientifically? Or could DNA be found on letters? But alas, such evidence might be long lost, and many leads, like the letters or items Dorothy left, were likely discarded or destroyed. Indeed, a relative mentioned that Dorothy's papers and letters that had been saved were eventually destroyed by a later generation, perhaps to protect privacy or simply as a matter of course. And so, the story of Dorothy Arnold remains a story. It is a narrative passed down through newspaper articles, books, and now our own retelling. It lives in that hazy space between fact and folklore. We have been careful to keep it factual and historically accurate, preserving each detail and theory that has surfaced. Yet we have also allowed ourselves to imagine the scenes and the feelings that facts alone cannot convey. In doing so, we get a fuller picture of Dorothy, not just as a case, but as a person, a vibrant young woman with hopes, flaws, loves, and troubles. Perhaps somewhere in the ether of history, Dorothy Arnold knows that her story has not been forgotten. One likes to think that if her spirit could hear this telling, she would feel sympathy for those who suffered in her absence, and gratitude for those who still remember her. If she left of her own will, perhaps she would want us to know she found what she was looking for. If she met with foul play or misfortune, perhaps she would want the truth known someday, when it can harm no one. And if she did succumb to despair, perhaps she would want to be remembered, not for that final act, but for the life she lived before it, a life of intellect, charm, and creativity that sadly met an untimely end. As we conclude, we gently close the book on this unsolved mystery. The clock has ticked on while we have been in this reverie of the past. The city of 1910 has faded into sepia tones, and the clatter of horse hooves and rustles of long skirts grow quiet. We return now to the present moment, carrying with us the echoes of Dorothy's footsteps on Fifth Avenue and the faint scent of violet and library papers that might have trailed in her wake. In a final thought, consider this. Each unsolved mystery is in a way a mirror. We see reflected our own fascination with the unknown, our empathy for the suffering of others, and our eternal hope that even the darkest night eventually yield to understanding. Dorothy Arnold's Disappearance invites us to be compassionate and thoughtful, to refrain from lurid speculation, and instead honor the human story behind it. It prompts a kind of soft vigilance, reminding us that behind every headline of a missing person is someone's daughter, sister, friend, who lived, laughed, and dreamed. Now in the soft darkness, we can let the mystery be, at least for tonight. It's time to rest. The story, with all its unanswered questions, has been told as completely as possible. The theories have been laid out like gentle cards on the table. The characters, Dorothy, her family, her secret love, the investigators, have each played their part in our narrative, and now step back into the mist of history. All that remains is a quiet space for reflection and perhaps, eventually, sleep. If your eyes grow heavy thinking of the lamplights of old New York and a young woman walking into eternity, that's okay. This tale was meant to be a companion for the night, something to occupy the mind just enough to let the world outside fade away.